Hi guys! Today I thought I would show you the two main watercolor techniques that people talk about in case you're not familiar with them. And those are the wet on wet techniques and the wet on dry technique. So I want to start with wet on wet, and I hope that you can see what I'm going to do here. I'm going to take my size 16 round brush full of water. This tip is very wet. I just dabbed it off a little on my paper towel. And I'm going to do a general shape of a flower petal. It's really hard because of the lighting to even see what I'm doing, I know. And it's actually hard for me to see as well. So when you're doing this, you got to kind of get it at an angle. So I'm just kind of going to make a little petal shape. And then I'm going to get some Scarlet Lake. That's the color I'm picking. And I'm going to touch it to a few areas of the water. So you can see that, where I'm kind of just touching, and you can see that I'm using wet paint on a wet surface. So this is wet on wet. And when you really get a lot of water going and a lot of paint, you'll get what everyone calls bleeds, watercolor bleeds, right? And a lot of people think those are really pretty. So this one isn't moving as much for me. So I'm gonna kind of help it around a little bit. The paint will only flow where the water is. That's the way you control where watercolor goes on your paper. Now, if I just take water again on my brush, no paint, and I'm gonna make another petal next to this one, but I'm gonna kind of overlap them. And now you can really see how the paint rushes in to the wet area next to it. And what can be fun to do is to then get a lot of paint on your brush for the next petal and to have a lot of contrast. So on this petal that I just did for you, that is your other technique, right? This is wet on dry. I had a lot of wet paint on my brush and I touched it to a dry surface. Now, when you have this beautiful wet area, you can go back, see that? And drop in pigment anywhere that it's wet for as long as it's wet. When it dries, it won't flow anymore and you'll just have a dot. All right, so now I'm gonna go ahead and get a bunch of water again. I'm gonna complete this flower for you. You see that beautiful, beautiful bleed. And what that can give you is just a lot of variation with your petals. So you can go back in with little lines and kind of tease it out, or you can take pigment and touch the outer edge, and also a lot of times the inner edge, because then the center of your flower is much darker than the edges of your flower. So that's really the difference between wet on wet and wet on dry. I also want to teach you this little trick that if you have a really dry brush, they call that a thirsty brush, you can actually pick up water and pigment. It's hard to undo watercolor, but you can pick up water and pigment while it's still wet with a dry brush. You just dry it off on a paper towel and see, now I can add a little, so you can pick the pigment up a little bit. You can add a little dimension to these petals by making them lighter towards the center, which makes it seem like those are kind of raised. The lighter something is, the closer it seems to you, and then the darker, right? So here we're going in with our darker pigment. The darker it is, the farther away. So if these are still wet a little bit, we can still add more pigment to the center and the outside. And so he's kind of a wonky little flower, but let's go ahead and add a wet on wet leaf. So I'm gonna take same size brush because we're just practicing. I'm gonna pull away from it like this with water. I like when my flower color bleeds into my leaf color. So I'm gonna make that leaf shape, and then I'm gonna put my green in it. That's a little bit of sap green and a little bit of green gold. And you can see that the green has bled back into the flower as well, which is what I really like about watercolor. I don't mind. Some people want to wait till the flower's dry and keep the colors really separate, and that's okay too. So then I can even use a darker pigment. And I really love the variation of that simple little leaf. So I hope that was helpful to you today. Hope you have an idea of what wet on wet versus wet on dry. Also learned a little bit about picking up pigment and using some of the different watercolor techniques. Have a great day and happy painting.